If you can beat me at chess, I'll make you my wife. Zaria's hand froze over the pristine white tablecloth. The man at the center table, the one the staff spoke of in terrified, skin-crawling whispers, stared at her with dark, calculating eyes that seemed to strip away her waitress uniform to find the hidden grandmaster beneath. Joon-Hyuk Kang. The name alone made the restaurant manager, Victor, sweat through his silk suit. "I'm sorry, sir. What did you just say?" Zaria's voice was calm, but her heart hammered against her ribs. "Checkmate me in under 5 minutes, and I will marry you tonight. You will have my name, my fortune, and my absolute protection." He wasn't smiling. A subtle dragon tattoo coiled up his neck, disappearing under his jet-black hair as he leaned over the board. "But if you lose, you leave this club and never show your face in this city again." The restaurant went silent. Silverware stopped clinking. Her coworker Rashida gripped her shoulder, whispering for her to walk away, but Zaria didn't move. She looked at the ivory chess piece in her hand and remembered the nights spent playing against herself in the dim light of the back room, dreaming of a way out of the debt crushing her family. "You're serious?" She set the water carafe down with a sharp thud. "I don't joke about strategy or life partners," Joon-Hyuk replied, resting his chin on a hand adorned with an expensive silver watch. "So, Zaria Okoye, do you have the courage to sit, or are you just another girl carrying a tray?" Every rational thought told her to run, but she had spent years being invisible, a ghost in a black bow tie. She pulled out the chair and sat. As her fingers touched the cold wood of the chessboard, the waitress vanished. The first move she made wasn't a defense, it was an attack. The midday sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Ivory Club, but the light didn't feel warm to Zaria Okoye. It just made the dust motes dancing over the expensive cognac bottles more visible. At 24, Zaria had mastered the art of being part of the furniture. She moved with a practiced, liquid grace, her white waitress shirt crisp and her black bow tie perfectly straight, weaving through tables of men who discussed million-dollar acquisitions as if she were a ghost. Her shift was a grueling marathon of ego and entitlement. "Another double espresso and make it quick," a man snapped without looking up from his tablet. Zaria nodded, her expression a mask of calm composure, though her mind was miles away, deep in a 64-square battlefield. Every spare second was a luxury she used to sharpen her mind. During a rare 3-minute lull in the service pantry, she pulled a crumpled linen napkin from her apron pocket. On it, she had scribbled a complex mid-game position she'd seen in an old tournament book the night before. Her eyes narrowed, her head tilting slightly as she visualized the knight's trajectory. If the bishop takes on G7, the king is exposed. But the rook sacrifice on the back rank is the real trap, she thought, her fingers twitching as if nudging a wooden piece across a board. "Zaria, table 4 needs their check, and stop daydreaming," Victor, the manager, hissed as he hurried past, his brow perpetually slick with the sweat of anxiety. Zaria tucked the napkin back into her pocket, the ink slightly blurred from the humidity of the kitchen. She smoothed her apron and stepped back out into the dining room, her tall frame cutting an elegant figure despite the heavy tray balanced on her hand. As she moved, she mentally reset the board. She was used to being underestimated, used to the guests seeing only a waitress instead of the girl who had once been a chess prodigy before her world collapsed. She survived the rush by playing games in her head, calculating the movements of the diners like pawns on a board. She knew which regular would complain about the temperature of the soup and which would leave a folding tip without a word. It was a predictable, exhausting cycle of survival. But as she cleared a discarded newspaper from an empty table, her eyes caught a headline about the city's rising crime rates and a name that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin: Joon-Hyuk Kang. She shivered, tucking the paper away. She just needed to finish the shift, collect her meager tips, and go home to the mounting bills. She didn't know that the predictable cycle of her life was about to be shattered by a man who played for much higher stakes than napkins and ink. The shift in the room was not gradual. It was a sudden, chilling atmospheric pressure drop that made the fine crystal glasses on the sideboard seem to hum. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Ivory Club swung open, and the usual low hum of elite gossip died in the throats of the city's most powerful men. Joon-Hyuk Kang walked in, and the air itself seemed to retreat. Standing at a commanding 61, he was a study in monochromatic intimidation. His black luxury suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like armor, worn over a black dress shirt that lay open at the collar, revealing the dark, curled tail of a dragon tattoo creeping up the side of his pale neck. His jet black hair was slicked back, exposing a sharp, angular jawline and eyes that didn't just look at the room, they dissected it. Behind him, Victor, the restaurant manager, appeared transformed. The man who had just been barking orders at Zaria was now a hunched shadow of himself, his face pale and slick with a fresh layer of terrified sweat as he guided the entourage toward the center table. Zaria stood near the service station, her fingers instinctively curling around the crumpled napkin in her pocket. She had seen powerful men before, but Joon-Hyuk carried a different kind of weight. He moved with a cold, athletic grace, his presence so dominant that the wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables suddenly looked like children playing dress-up. As he reached the table, he didn't sit immediately. He paused, his intense dark eyes scanning the perimeter until they landed briefly on Zaria. For a heartbeat, her breath hitched. It wasn't the look of a customer checking for service. It was the look of a grandmaster evaluating a piece on a board he already owned. He pulled out a chair, the screech of wood against the marble floor sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. He sat, resting his chin on a hand adorned with a heavy silver watch, his gaze fixed on the empty space before him as if he could already see the battle lines drawn. The dragon had arrived, and the quiet safety of Zaria's invisible life had just gone up in flames. Joon-Hyuk Kang did not order a drink. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a small, weighted bag, placing it on the table with a heavy, rhythmic thud that echoed through the silence. From the bag, he began to pull out chess pieces, not the cheap plastic sets from the back room, but hand-carved obsidian and ivory that caught the light like polished gemstones. "This city is full of men who claim to be masters of strategy," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried to every corner of the room. He didn't look up as he set the Black King in its place. "They move money, they move lives, but they cannot move a wooden piece without trembling." He leaned back, his sharp jawline silhouetted against the dim amber lighting of the club. His intense dark eyes finally swept over the crowd of elite patrons, a cold, mocking smirk playing on his lips. "I am bored. I have spent the afternoon crushing grandmasters who play by the book and die by the book." He tapped his silver watch, the metal gleaming. "So let's make it interesting, a gift for the bored elite." The room held its breath. Victor, the manager, stood frozen like a statue of salt. Zaria, standing by the service station with a tray of untouched crystal, felt a strange chill. This wasn't just a game, it was a performance of dominance. "The challenge is simple," Joon-Hyuk announced, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "Anyone in this room who can beat me in a single game of speed chess, 5 minutes on the clock, will earn a seat at my table as my wife. You will have my name, my fortune, and my absolute protection for life." A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Men looked at their wives, socialites whispered behind manicured hands. It was an absurd, romantic, and terrifying proposition. "But," he added, his gaze turning razor-sharp, "if you lose, you leave this club and this city. You lose your status, your career, and your right to ever stand in my presence again. I have no room in my world for those who overestimate their own minds." He gestured to the empty chair across from him, the ivory queen standing lonely on the board. "The king's gambit is open. Who among you actually knows how to play?" Zaria's hand tightened on her tray. She looked at the obsidian pieces, her mind involuntarily calculating the opening moves. She was a waitress, a ghost in a white shirt, but as she looked at the board, the familiar patterns of the Sicilian defense began to fire in her brain like lightning. The silence was broken not by a hero, but by the sharp click of polished Oxfords against the marble. Arthur Sterling, a billionaire hedge fund manager and a regular at the club who prided himself on his analytical mind, stepped forward with a condescending chuckle. He adjusted his silk tie, offering Joon-Hyuk a stiff nod as he pulled out the chair. A charming game, Mr. Kang, Sterling said, his voice dripping with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. I believe I can show you that some of us in this city still know how to think under pressure. Zaria watched from the shadows of the service station, her tray trembling slightly. She knew Sterling. He was the type of player who relied on brute force and expensive tutors. As the digital chess clock was set to 5 minutes, the room crowded around, a sea of velvet dresses and tailored tuxedos pressing in to witness the slaughter. Joon-Hyuk didn't even look at Sterling's face. His eyes were fixed on the board, his posture as still as a predator waiting for a twig to snap. White or black? Joon-Hyuk asked, his voice a cold blade. I'll take white, Sterling replied, reaching for an ivory pawn. The advantage of the first move, after all. The game began with a flurry of motion. Sterling played aggressively, pushing his pieces forward in a classic scholar's attempt to overwhelm the center. But Joon-Hyuk's responses were instantaneous. He didn't think. He reacted with a terrifying, instinctive precision. His hand moved like a blur, the obsidian pieces clicking against the board with the finality of a gavel. By the 3-minute mark, Sterling's forehead was mapped with beads of sweat. His analytical mind was failing him as Joon-Hyuk's defense tightened like a noose. Zaria leaned in, her eyes darting across the squares. He's overextending his knight, she realized, her heart sinking for the man she didn't even like. He doesn't see the discovered attack on his queen. 2 moves later, it happened. Joon-Hyuk slid a black bishop across the diagonal, a silent executioner. Sterling froze, his hand hovering over the board as the realization of his blunder turned his face a sickly shade of gray. Checkmate in 3, Joon-Hyuk whispered, finally looking up. His dark eyes were devoid of mercy. You played for the crowd, Arthur. I played for the kill. Sterling stood up, his legs visibly shaking. The room was deathly quiet as he realized the weight of the stakes. He had lost his standing, his pride, and his seat at the Ivory Club in less than 5 minutes. As he was escorted out by Joon-Hyuk's silent security, the Mafia boss reset the board with a bored flick of his wrist. Next, Joon-Hyuk commanded, his gaze sweeping the room again. No one moved. The experts were suddenly very interested in the bottoms of their glasses. The silence that followed Sterling's exit was heavy, a physical weight that made the air in the Grand Ivory Club feel stagnant. Joon-Hyuk Kang sighed, a sound of profound boredom, and began to reach for the board as if to pack the obsidian pieces away. The intellectuals of the city had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. Zaria moved before she could talk herself out of it. Her reflection in the polished mahogany of a nearby sideboard showed a tall, elegant woman in a waitress uniform, but her eyes, large, dark brown, and suddenly sharp, belonged to someone else entirely. She stepped toward the center table to clear the discarded water glass Sterling had left behind. As her fingers brushed the condensation, her gaze locked onto the board. Joon-Hyuk was already looking away, his silver watch catching the light as he checked the time. You wouldn't have lost the knight if you'd played the intermediate move. Rook to e8, Zaria said. Her voice was low, melodic, and carried a quiet authority that cut through the hushed room like a razor. Joon-Hyuk's hand froze. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he slowly tilted his head, his intense dark eyes narrowing as he studied the position Zaria had just described. The room went deathly still. Victor, the manager, looked as though he might faint, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. What did you say, girl? Joon-Hyuk asked, his voice a dangerous, velvet purr. Rook to e8, Zaria repeated, setting the glass on her tray with a definitive clack. She didn't flinch. It forces the king into the corner and nullifies your bishop's diagonal. He wouldn't have one, but he wouldn't have been humiliated in 10 moves. Joon-Hyuk finally looked up. His gaze was a physical force, calculating and cold, stripping away her black bow tie and fitted apron to see the mind beneath. A slow, predatory smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. A waitress who understands the geometry of the board, he mused, leaning back and resting his chin on his hand. And tell me, Zaria, I believe that is the name on your tag. Do you just critique the slaughter, or do you have the courage to bleed? I've been bleeding my whole life, Mr. Kang, Zaria replied, her calm posture radiating a quiet power that stunned the onlookers. A game of chess is the least of my worries. Then sit, Joon-Hyuk dared, gesturing to the ivory chair. Let's see if your hands are as steady as your tongue. Zaria felt Rashida's terrified gaze from across the room, but she didn't look back. She pulled out the chair and sat, her 58 frame mirroring his elegance. As she reached for the ivory pieces, the room felt as though it had shifted on its axis. The underdog had taken her seat. Zaria sat across from Joon-Hyuk, her tall, elegant frame casting a long shadow over the ivory pieces. The visual contrast was electric. The invisible waitress in her black bow tie and fitted apron facing the dragon in his perfectly tailored suit. The air in the Grand Ivory Club felt vacuum-sealed, as if every patron had collectively stopped breathing to witness the social hierarchy collapse in real time. The clock is set to 5 minutes, Joon-Hyuk said, his intense dark eyes never leaving hers. Since you've spent so much time studying my board from the sidelines, I'll give you the advantage. You take white. Zaria didn't hesitate. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes narrowing at the board with a confident, calm gaze. She reached out with a steady hand and moved her king's pawn to e4. It was a classic opening, but she played it with a crisp, professional snap that made Joon-Hyuk's eyebrows twitch upward in surprise. Bold, he murmured, his hand a blur as he responded with the Sicilian defense. The game accelerated instantly. This wasn't the slow, plodding match Sterling had played. It was a rhythmic, percussive exchange. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of the pieces hitting the wood echoed like a heartbeat. Zaria moved with a liquid grace, her mind firing through permutations she had practiced on greasy napkins during her breaks. Joon-Hyuk's playstyle was predatory, an aggressive, suffocating press designed to make his opponents panic. He watched her constantly, leaning his chin on his hand, searching for a flicker of fear in her expressive dark brown eyes. But Zaria was a stone. She met his intense gaze with a quiet power, her fingers dancing across the board with a speed that left the surrounding elite gasping. You're not just a waitress, Zaria Okoye, Joon-Hyuk whispered as he captured one of her knights. Who taught a ghost to fight like a general? The world taught me, she replied, her voice low and steady. When you're invisible, you have a lot of time to watch people make mistakes. She slid her bishop across the board, pinning his rook. The move was so unexpected that Joon-Hyuk actually paused for a full second, his calculating eyes widening. The room remained in a stunned silence. For the first time that night, the Mafia boss wasn't smirking. He was thinking. As the digital timer ticked down past the 3-minute mark, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Zaria wasn't just surviving, she was hunting. The digital display on the chess clock bled red, the seconds ticking away with the mechanical cruelty of a countdown. The atmosphere in the Grand Ivory Club had shifted from a spectacle to a fever dream. The elite patrons pressed in, their expensive perfumes and colognes stifling, but Zaria didn't smell them. She only smelled the faint, sharp scent of Joon-Hyuk's expensive sandalwood and the cold ozone of the air conditioning. The packing turned electric. Click, clack, click. The sound of the pieces hitting the obsidian and ivory board was no longer a rhythm, it was a barrage. Zaria's hands, usually steady from years of carrying heavy trays, moved with a blur of lethal precision. She wasn't just reacting anymore, she was dictating the flow of the war. Across the room, Rashida watched with her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide as she saw her quiet coworker transform. The invisible girl was gone. In her place sat a strategist whose every tilt of the head and narrowing of the eyes signaled a cold, calculated intent. Zaria was no longer serving. She was ruling the 64 squares between her and the most dangerous man in the city. Joon-Hyuk's composure began to fray at the edges. His intense dark eyes darted across the board, his jawline tight as he realized his aggressive press had been met with a flexible, unbreakable wall. He moved a knight to threaten her king, his silver watch flashing as he slammed the clock. He had less than 90 seconds left. You're playing for your life, aren't you? Joon-Hyuk whispered, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. I'm playing for my family, Zaria countered, her voice like ice. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't need to. She could feel the time in her marrow. She slid a rook forward, a move that seemed to leave her flank exposed. The room gasped. To the untrained eye, she had just handed the game to the Mafia boss. Victor, the manager, clutched his chest, certain that his restaurant was about to become a crime scene. Joon-Hyuk's hand hovered over his queen, a predatory smirk ghosting back onto his lips. He saw the mistake. He saw the opening. But as he looked into Zaria's calm, expressive dark brown eyes, he saw something else. A trap so deep it had no bottom. The speed match had reached its agonizing peak, and the dragon was realizing he might have been the one being hunted all along. Joon-Hyuk's hand hovered over the board, his intense dark eyes locked on Zaria's exposed queen. The room was so silent that the hum of the overhead chandelier sounded like a roar. This was the moment of the kill, the opening every spectator thought signaled the end of the invisible girl. "A desperate move, Zaria," Joon-Hyuk whispered, his voice a dangerous, velvet purr. "You've given me your heart to save your king." With a decisive snap, he slid his obsidian bishop across the board, capturing her ivory queen. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Victor, the manager, closed his eyes, unable to watch the fallout of such a catastrophic blunder. Even Rashida looked away, her hands trembling. But Zaria didn't flinch. Her tall, elegant frame remained perfectly still, her head slightly tilted as she narrowed her eyes at the new geometry of the board. The queen's sacrifice wasn't a mistake, it was a clearance. By removing her own most powerful piece, she had opened a microscopic diagonal that Joon-Hyuk, in his predatory hunger, had completely overlooked. "I didn't give you my heart, Mr. Kang," Zaria said, her voice a calm, chilling anchor in the high-tension room. "I gave you a ghost to chase." Her hand moved like a flash of white silk. She slid her knight to h3. Joon-Hyuk's smirk vanished. His jaw tightened as he realized the knight move delivered a double check. He had to move his king. He reached out, his silver watch gleaming, and shifted his piece to the only safe square left. Zaria didn't wait for him to breathe. She moved her rook to the back rank. Click. The sound was as final as a tomb door closing. Joon-Hyuk froze. His calculating eyes darted across the board, searching for an escape, a counterattack, a hidden resource. There were none. The Obsidian King was trapped behind its own pawns, suffocated by the very defense he had used to bully the city's elite. "Smothered mate," Zaria whispered, her expressive dark brown eyes meeting his intense gaze with a quiet, undeniable power. The digital clock ticked down its final 3 seconds and went dark. The room was paralyzed. The Mafia boss, the man who owned the city's secrets and its fears, had been checkmated by the woman who had served him water 5 minutes ago. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Zaria slowly pulling her hand back and resting it on her fitted black apron. She had played the ultimate gamble, and the dragon had fallen. The silence in the Grand Ivory Club was no longer oppressive. It was reverent. Joon-Hyuk Kang sat frozen, his intense dark eyes fixed on the board where his Obsidian King stood trapped by its own defenses. The digital clock remained dark, a silent witness to the impossible. Slowly, Joon-Hyuk reached out. Zaria didn't flinch, her calm posture radiating a quiet power that seemed to fill the room. Instead of overturning the board in a rage, the Mafia boss gently tipped his king over with a single finger. The wooden piece clicked against the table, a white flag in a war of wits. He looked up, and for the first time, the cold, predatory smirk was gone, replaced by a look of genuine, haunting fascination. He stood up, his tall, commanding frame unfolding with a grace that usually signaled a threat, but now signaled a salute. He didn't look at the crowd of stunned socialites or the trembling manager. He looked only at Zaria. "You didn't just play a game, Zaria Okoye," he said, his baritone voice vibrating through the still air. "You dismantled a kingdom." He walked around the table, stopping just inches from her. The visual contrast was stark, the waitress in her black bow tie and the king in his tailored armor, but the power dynamic had permanently shifted. He reached out, his silver watch catching the light, and took her hand. It wasn't a gesture of a master to a servant, but of an equal to an equal. "I am a man of my word," he murmured, his dark eyes searching hers, finding the hidden fire she had spent years dampening. "You are no longer a ghost in this club. You are the woman who conquered the dragon. My name, my wealth, and my protection are yours. Tonight, the world stops looking through you." Zaria felt the weight of the moment, the crushing burden of her family's debt finally lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a grandmaster who had claimed her throne. As Joon-Hyuk led her toward the exit, the room finally erupted, not in mockery, but in a standing ovation that followed the invisible girl as she walked out of the shadows and into a life she had only ever dared to dream of on a crumpled napkin. The waitress was gone. The queen had arrived.